Running the floor, Embiid stuffs it.
Harden for three. James Harden with his second triple.
What is going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Pick Swap Podcast. No James today, but I'm here with a special guest, Kayla Santiago. She is a play-by-play announcer for Del Mar Sports. Kayla, how are you today?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me. How are you?
Yeah, excited to have you on. And before we get fully into it, I do want to give a shout out to our sponsor, BetUS. BetUS is one of the leading sportsbooks and casinos in the marketplace. Got whatever you need as far as the NBA Finals bets, futures bets, and everything else you could be looking for. So make sure to click the link in our description, hop on and use code PICKSWAP at login to cash in on all your needs. So to jump right in, I want to talk some Sixers with Kayla today. Obviously, a couple weeks into the offseason now, the new news is, of course, the Sixers have the 23rd overall pick. The Nets did officially defer to that. So good news in terms of Sixers having an asset there and something to work with this offseason and a little something to keep me going and motivated. And, always loving to dive into draft stuff. So excited about that. But before we get fully into it, what were your overall thoughts on the season, Kayla, and kind of how disappointed were you with how it ended?
I was very disappointed in terms of when the Sixers got James Harden. You think championship or bust at that point, or at least this season going in, knowing the whole Ben Simmons drama happening, but knowing the team you have surrounded by Joel Embiid, the conversation you want to have with yourself is they have to get to the Eastern Conference Finals. Like, that has been the hump that they have been trying to get over for the past few seasons with Joel Embiid, and that's been the toughest thing. Now, you talk about that Heat series and you talk about the Heat game. I knew as soon as Joel was hurt, the Sixers weren't going any further because they were not a team that could beat the Heat without Joel Embiid. And I think that's why he's so valuable, because everybody says, well, he has James Harden, he has Tobias Harris, but the team just doesn't click when he's not there. They don't play well. He does a lot of different things that don't even show up in the stat sheet so that the team can win. I expected the Sixers to be a lot better than they were. I think I expected James Harden to be a little bit better. But I also think that Joel said it best towards the end of the season. He's not the Harden that is going to be the MVP level Harden from the Rockets who's going to score 60 a night on you. He's going to be the facilitator guy. And for the Sixers, that's just not what they need. They don't need another Ben Simmons. They need a guy like Jimmy Butler, who I love dearly, and ever since he's left Philadelphia, I've been upset about. But they need a guy like that who, no matter what, is going to drive to the basket, give it their all, and be that second option scoring for Joel Embiid. And they still haven't found that. And that has been the toughest thing to watch, I think, over the previous seasons, seeing that Joel Embiid, at this point, he's playing his best basketball. Who knows how much longer he has. And the Sixers organization, once again, just not really giving him the pieces to succeed.
Yeah, it's very tough. Like, on the one hand, it's like a very reasonable loss in terms of obviously the injuries. We saw he got surgery on both hands following the offseason. He was out there with neither hand at 100% and the broken face, and just who knows what percentage he was at, missing the first two games. And even like the 60% or whatever he was of himself when he returned was enough to win back-to-back games, to make it a series again, to change things. And he is just the most important player on the Sixers team on both sides of the court, which is tough to put a value on and pretty much impossible to replace. So on like the one hand, it's super understandable not winning the series, but at the same time, we're now in the same spot for 5 years running with this core and with Joel Embiid as the centerpiece. And time is starting to tick with when that window to win, how long it will stay open. And Harden is not a guy who extended that window by any means. It's 32 years old and a guy that like is playing towards his age and even looking a little bit older at this point. So it is difficult. It's tough where to go. I'm personally kind of still have hope just based on like, I'm hearing a lot of good things about Harden this offseason and with his training. He's worked with a couple reputable trainers and seems to be taking care of himself. At the end of the day, he is still 32 years old. That's not ancient in NBA terms. When you look at guys like Chris Paul, who's 5 years older than him and still playing at a pretty high level. Now, granted, the Suns didn't get it done in the playoffs either, so not the best example there. But like there are aspects of Harden's game that I think he can learn and add years to it in terms of if he adds a catch and shoot 3-point shot and looking more comfortable with that, some semblance of a mid-range game, being more comfortable attacking the basket. There are things that you can squint and look at and hope that it really was the hamstring, because he didn't have that pop. He didn't have that. And how much of it is age, how much of his hamstring is kind of the $1 million question. I think when the trade was initially like done, it pretty much the Sixers had married themselves to James Harden. And that was kind of the understanding. Do you think that's the case, or is there any chance that that's not how it works out?
I think Daryl Morey is definitely going to keep working with Harden. I think that they have been trying to get James Harden for the past 2 seasons now. We kind of saw it before, how, everybody wanted either Matisse Thybulle with Simmons or Tyrese Maxey with Ben Simmons, and that was just a no deal. And now they finally get him. I don't think if you're the Sixers front office that you give up on James Harden that easily. Now, on the other side of things, you have James Harden back for another year. You try to work things out. He gets hurt, or he's really good at the beginning of the season and then fades away in the playoffs. And that's really been a story of his whole entire career. I mean, that's not just the Sixers, but that's been his whole entire career. And I think as a Sixers fan and looking at this from an NBA standpoint, that's kind of what scares me, because you're looking at a guy that is not willing to step up when he's needed to. You look at the NBA right now, and every single star kind of has a wingman, I could say. You look at Giannis, right? Drew Holiday stepped up huge in the playoffs. A year ago, Chris Middleton was the reason they got through the first round. Giannis obviously is that centerpiece, and he's going to dominate, but he has other guys that he can rely on when he's not having a good game to step up and take control. James Harden, I think it's a mindset thing. I understand that he's older, and I understand he's not in the prime of his career, but if he goes out there and only puts up 2 shots in the second half of an elimination game, that's just unacceptable, and that's just a lack of effort. I don't care about the injury, honestly, and I don't care if you go 0 for 20. At least try. At least do something. And if he doesn't have that initiative to take that into next season, I don't know how the front office can stick behind him still. I really don't.
Yeah, it's tough. Like, it's difficult to form a championship team with half a season together, and like the trade of the deadline, making it all work. And some of it is learning to play with each other and learning how the pieces fit together. But one of like the critiques that has always been said about James Harden is like how he will shoot you out of a game. And I'm sitting here being like, I would love to see that. I would love to see this guy just jack up 10 3-pointers and see what falls, because like that would be refreshing on the Sixers team to have a guy that do that. And that's not the version of James Harden we saw at all. We obviously see the high IQ, the playmaking, everything that he does bring to the table. Still an incredibly useful NBA player, but not quite the top tier superstar that like I think he was perceived to be and hoped to be. And when we talk about the Morey and Harden relationship, like there's so much here from like Morey's made 2 major blockbuster trades in his career, and both of them were for James Harden. And his first one with the Rockets, this is when Harden was still a 6-man with the OKC Thunder. This was a guy that he kind of bet the bank on that he could be the superstar, and he turned out to be. So they're so connected with that aspect that like I see no way of Morey and the Sixers walking away from him. The money thing is kind of the $1 million question. He obviously has that $40+ million option to opt into. The perception seems to be that he is not going to take that, and he's going to do somewhat of a take less money to help the team and find a way to make that work. But the thing with me is I don't really know what less money is to James Harden in terms of like, if this is a 3-year, $130 million deal, like sure, that might not be like a max, but that's still doesn't give the team a ton of flexibility. Do you have any feel what you think the contract could look like if there is, or do you think he opts in?
It's tough, because I think as much as I like James Harden, I think it can be all talk a little bit and taking less money, because when it comes down to it, his agent and James Harden, they're going to go off the Rockets days. They're going to go off the superstar mentality that he has and the guy that he can be. And they're going to try to work off his potential to make sure that he doesn't get gypped of any money. I think that he's going to try to sign that 3-year, and I think he's going to try to be with the Sixers for an extensive amount of time. I do believe that Harden wants to win an NBA championship. You're talking about a guy that's a superstar who can really make a difference not only in the city, but can also win that NBA championship and break that barrier right there and become not a super team, but a dynamic duo with him and Joel Embiid. Now, here's the thing with that. The bench depth has really hurt the Sixers. You talk about a guy like Danny Green going out in that elimination game. The next man up is Matisse Thybulle, who really can't play offensively, plays well on defense, but then who else do you go to on your bench when Matisse Thybulle all of a sudden has to be playing major minutes because Danny Green is out? I think they're really going to run into an issue, and it's going to be tough for them to try to figure out, all right, how much money can they give to James Harden? How much money do they need to try to get actual pieces to make them a good team? You look at some of the best teams in the NBA and why they were able to make certain runs. It's because they have a lot of depth, because they've been playing together for a while as well. Now, I do like your point about, they got him after the trade deadline, not even half a season, and they're expected to win a championship. That's just not going to happen. You look at the Celtics right now, and the way that Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown have been able to play together, and now that Al Horford's back in the mix, this is a team that has been building up together as a squad and putting the pieces in when needed and getting those guys back to really make a difference. I don't know if they're going to win the NBA championship, but they look very, very good right now. But that's what it's going to take. That chemistry is going to build. I think another year will be good for James Harden and Joel Embiid. It's just how much do we believe if he's actually going to settle down and take less money to help the team get pieces they need to actually go on and win an NBA championship.
Yeah, absolutely. And to talk about the Celtics, like this is a team that was discussed about, do they need to break up Tatum and Brown literally earlier this year? And it's something
Right.
that like I think across the NBA teams are not patient enough in like letting things develop, letting guys learn how to play together. And I think that could be the case with Harden and Embiid as well, especially considering James Harden is a guy who's known to check in and check out a little bit. And his latest time with the Brooklyn Nets was certainly a point where he was checked out and not playing his best, not probably taking the best care of himself. A full
Right.
offseason of him fully locked in, fully taking care of himself, and ready to prove people wrong is something I would love to see. Now, granted, this might be me looking at it completely optimistically. And I also totally agree with your point about like the other massive holes on the Sixers team, and the bench is the greatest example. I've been incredibly frustrated by the entire NBA playoffs watching. If you take like these top teams, pretty much 1 through 12, all of those guys are better than the Sixers bench options. And the Sixers just tend to get this collection of like one-dimensional players that each do a certain thing, and you just can't win when in the NBA like that. Like there's such a small margin for error when you get into these deeper rounds of the playoffs, and the Sixers have been put on blast for this repetitively. So when we talk about that, and we look at the bench, like there's certain guys that I think like that needs to be a priority. Matisse Thybulle, who you brought up there, for me personally, is a guy that I think has to be flipped this offseason. I also understand his value is probably at the lowest it's been, so it's tough to swallow. But I personally don't think that he will ever develop into a player with an offensive game that allows him to play more minutes than he do. And looking at like the playoffs this year, like the opposing defense don't even acknowledge he's out there. So it's essentially playing 5-on-4 in the same way that was talked about with Ben Simmons, except he is unable to pass or dribble in the way that Ben Simmons can. So do you think there's any hope of Matisse Thybulle coming back, or is that somebody you think is going to be on the move?
I think as somebody who really loves the NBA, I think Matisse needs to be on the move. Now, will the Sixers actually do that? I don't know, because I think they like his potential a lot. But this is the thing. You look at a guy like Tyrese Maxey, right? And you see the potential that he has. You've seen how he's grown. And he didn't have the best playoffs, especially in the second round, but that's because he's literally 21 years old. And he's a starter for the first time in the playoffs and played a lot last year in the postseason as well. But you look at a guy like that and you're saying, okay, we can wait out on him because his potential is now. You know, he really blossomed this season. He definitely was looked at as a sixth man of the year candidate. And that's not necessarily top 3, but definitely was in that conversation just a little bit. And you look at Tyrese Maxey and you say, okay, his timeline of potential matches up with Joel Embiid's longevity as well. Joel Embiid's still probably going to be dominant for a few more years. You give Tyrese Maxey even one more year next season, he can really be that player that now has a level of experience going into the postseason. Matisse Thybulle, I don't see that. Now, he's not in a position like Tyrese Maxey. He's not a starter. But when you're coming off the bench and you need scoring and you need that spark plug, I'd rather have TJ McConnell on my bench than have Matisse Thybulle right now, if I'm going to be honest. And I hate to say that because I really, really liked Matisse when he came in, and I think he had a lot of promise. I think he's a standout guy. We saw a lot of the interviews during the NBA draft. But when you're talking about a team that is ready to win now, this is not the place for Matisse.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of development, like this is a guy who's 25 years old. He's played 4 years in college, 3 years in the NBA. There's should be more signs of progress than we have seen at this point. And Maxey is obviously a unique case in how fast he's developed, but he's a guy who certainly just breathed life into this franchise and given like a second win to this championship burst. I mean, if Tyrese Maxey has not turned out to the player like that he currently is, I think the conversation is very different surrounding the Sixers right now. And a guy that I'm personally extremely excited about, a guy that should be absolutely untouchable in my book. But how high do you think the ceiling is for Tyrese Maxey moving forward?
I think he's a Lou Williams type effect. I really do. And, you know, I know Tyrese Maxey's not going to play off the bench, but I think he can come in and have serious, consistent 30-point games and be that guy that can light up a spark in the playoffs. I'm not going to say that he's going to be at the level of Chris Paul or Devin Booker or Jason Tatum. I don't think that's his ceiling. Maybe more like a Drew Holiday. Maybe more like him. I wouldn't even say Chris Middleton right yet, but I think Tyrese Maxey is going to be that guy like Drew Holiday that's going to make those defensive plays at the end of games. That's going to out-hustle people to make sure that he gets the last 2 points of a game so they can go off and win. He's going to be that guy that's going to be a crucial piece, and that you wouldn't necessarily build your team around at all. You know, he's not a Joel Embiid, he's not a Giannis, he's not a Jokic, but he's the second man you want on your team. I even think that right now, if you look at James Harden coming into next season, Tyrese Maxey is your second option as a scorer. And that's not the way it should be, but just how he's been able to make defenses crash on it, and how he's been able to hit that high up off the glass. And then his three-point percentage has really, really improved in the way he's been able to take those shots and just completely work. I mean, that's a special kid right there. You talk about him being 21 years old. That's his talent, but that's also the work that he puts in on the gym. That's the work that we don't see behind the scenes as fans, as viewers, as the media, that Tyrese Maxey is doing everything that he needs to do to be the player that he wants to be. I don't think he's going to be a superstar. I don't think he's going to be an MVP, but I think he's going to be in conversations to be the sixth man of the year, to be the most improved player, to be a guy like Drew Holiday on your team that's your second option and that can really make an impact on both sides of the floor.
Yeah, it's been tremendous watching him so far. And I mean, like, it's first off, it's refreshing from a Sixers aspect because we've seen so many guys who just have seemingly not taken that step forward, and to see Maxey just taking leaps and bounds forward so quickly is so exciting. And another thing that does kind of give me hope with when we talk about the Harden situation, and Maxey's a key piece of this, I do think the trio of Maxey, Harden, and Embiid is something that works. And now, granted, would you hope Harden's a little more involved in the scoring and less of the passer? Sure, but the fact that it's getting done is really what matters. And him, I mean, his scoring was completely unlocked with Harden coming on board, taking those playmaking responsibilities off Maxey's shoulders and allowing him to just go get a bucket in the way he's best at definitely made him better. So that was an aspect that definitely appealed to me. I think definitely helps with Harden alongside, and certainly like pushes me toward wanting Harden back as well. So in terms of Maxey long term, I really have like sky high beliefs for him. And the reason I say that is like, you just can't, I really haven't seen a guy progress at the rate that he is. So it's tough for me to put a cap on it. Now, granted, there's still concerns in his games. Obviously, he's a little bit undersized for a guy that his frame. You would love for him to be more of a true point guard role, which he is not. But I think in the long term, like, this is still a guy that is going to be a potential key piece for your franchise and like a legitimate in the starting caliber, close to number 1, 2, 3 option on like a championship caliber team. Maybe not number 1, but in that range of a guy that's an every night contributor. And just like everything about him in terms of like the joy he plays with, the smile. He's a guy that I just love having around and want for this franchise. So Maxey certainly breathes some hope into me. That has to be the core in terms of Embiid, Maxey, and Harden in my mind. And it is really cool that kind of that trio seems to be working.
Yeah, and I think, Maxey, you look at trades and you look at trade talks that I'm sure the Sixers are going to look at in the offseason and before the trade deadline. In my opinion, Tyrese Maxey's untouchable unless you're getting like Steph Curry on this team, because I think that Tyrese just adds such a unique opportunity for the Sixers squad. You talk about there's going to be games where Joel Embiid's out. There's going to be games where Joel Embiid's hurt. James Harden might not be playing 100%. Tyrese Maxey has an ability to take over games, and we've seen that already this season. I need to see that a little bit more from James Harden. I can be okay with him having that playmaker ability and being the third option when Embiid and Maxey are both red hot that night. Of course, you're going to want James Harden to feed the hot hand. But what I don't want is for the Sixers to be an elimination game and James Harden refuses to attack when his team needs him in the second half. That's when he has to have the switch mindset and be like, all right, I'm going to take over this game because I'm freaking James Harden. Like, I can make any team miss. I can do what I need to do, the step back threes. Shoot, I don't care if you miss. It's the same thing we said with Ben Simmons a few years ago. Take the shots. If you miss, it is what it is. And then everybody will be mad about that. But at least you tried. At least you put effort out there. And that's something that James Harden is going to have to try to switch on and off next season, because the playmaking ability that he has, I think, was really good for Joel Embiid, but it was even better for Tyrese Maxey. As soon as James Harden came in, and this is a lot of the conversation about the MVP talk with Joel Embiid and things like that, Maxey wasn't the player he was until James Harden came in. He was good, and we knew the potential he had, but as soon as Harden came into that gym, that made Maxey 100 times better. Able to spread the floor, as you mentioned. Maxey wasn't the number 1 point guard anymore. He was able to do things off the ball where his game is the best. And James was able to bring that, and I think he still will next year. But listen, in my opinion, Maxey's untouchable, and I think Joel and Tyrese can be a decent duo for years to come.
Yeah, totally agree with all that, and excellent points there. Another guy I want to talk about, and this has been a guy that's kind of been up and down in the eyes of Sixers fans, but Tobias Harris. Obviously, there's been the talks about the contracts. I don't want to drag him too much because I do believe in the playoffs. Like, he is coming off one of, if not the one of his best stretches of basketball throughout his entire career, and he deserves a ton of respect for adapting his game and finding a way to fit and at least making moderations to how he plays, which is not an easy thing to do at the level and in the time frame that he did. But I mean, realistically, when you do look at this team and look at the cap situation, this is a guy that's going to be making more than Joel Embiid next year, a $36.5 million cap hit. To do anything really, there needs to be some sort of Tobias trade in my mind. Do you think there's a chance Tobias is back next year, or do you think he's going to be on the move?
I think there's going to be options for him to leave. And I really like Tobias Harris because I think that he's that locker room guy that a lot of teams need. Like the Celtics have Al Horford type guy. You know, Tobias Harris is that type of guy that's a veteran that's going to lead your team vocally, not on the court. But at the same time, giving away Tobias Harris could get you maybe 4 pieces. You know what I mean? Could maybe give you a starter to replace him and maybe 2 other bench pieces. You know, you don't have to go out and get a whole nother star. You don't have to go out and get a Bradley Beal or things like that. You can get serious pieces that will help not only your bench, but also will just give you that opportunity. Like a Seth Curry type guy, right? I miss Seth and I really liked him on the Sixers, but you get Seth, say this trade could happen, which it wouldn't. You get Seth and then a few other pieces to add to your bench. That's a good team right there because Curry's a decent player. He's a role player. That's what he's destined for. And I think for Tobias Harris, you know, at the moment right now, he was looked to be that second scorer. I know we had James Harden and I know the Sixers had Tyrese Maxey, but Tobias was set up with his contract and how much he gets paid to be better than he's been. And that's not the player he is. You know, he's not a Jimmy Butler. And Jimmy said Tobias over me. And I mean, he was right to say that because Tobias is not the guy that's going to take over in a game. He's just not. And he's not the aggressor. He's a guy that will put it all out there 100%. The dude that will get injured and no matter what, try to be out there for his team and a stand-up guy and a class act. And I think he's given Philly a lot. But at the same time, he's not untouchable. He's a guy that if you have options and you have an opportunity to bring in a few pieces or a really good player, he has to be on the move if a team's willing to take that contract.
Yeah, definitely. And I know I said I'm not going to drag him, but it is rare for a guy to just score 20 points so quietly in the way that he does in a matter of like, you don't even realize, then look up and he's got 22. And it's kind of like one of those, like, where did those come from? Or how did that impact the game really, which is frustrating. And I also totally agree that flipping him for multiple pieces and filling out the bench, filling out the depth in the way that we just kind of talked about is exactly what would make the most sense for this team. And especially with now 2 years remaining on his deal, I think there's enough that like, at one point, Tobias's contract was so intimidating across the rest of the league, one of like the worst contracts regarding that kind of thing. I think those talks have settled down. 2 years remaining, you can kind of swallow that. And he does still bring production. He's not a zero. It's not a guy you're trading away for nothing. I mean, there's like the John Wall talks and those kind of players that it's like it's really a question mark. You at least know what you're getting with Tobias, and he's still a guy that can add to a team. To turn a little negative, I mean, we kind of touched on it throughout, but this postseason has been a little bit of just a pain in Sixers' hearts in terms of we see the Al Horford success in this playoffs. We saw the Jimmy Butler. Which one of those would you say is more painful watching?
Jimmy Butler, 100%. I mean, watching Al Horford last night, it was like a stab to the heart, but Al Horford didn't want to be in Philadelphia. And how the Sixers were constructed when Al Horford was on the team didn't give him an opportunity to succeed. You're talking about Joel Embiid, Ben Simmons, and Al Horford all wanting to be in the paint at the same time. You're talking about Ben Simmons not having an ability to take a shot and not giving opportunities for Al Horford or Joel Embiid to really play the way they wanted to. So he was never going to succeed in Philly as well as he will with Boston just because how they're constructed. Jimmy Butler, on the other hand, if he stayed with Philadelphia, I can tell you right now that the Sixers would already have won an NBA championship. That duo between him and Joel Embiid was fantastic to watch. He made Joel better. He made Joel have that mindset of saying, yo, you need to go out there and dominate every night because when you do, you're one of the best players, if not the best in the NBA right now. You can really annihilate any single person you want, but you have to want it, and you want to have that mindset to go out there and dominate every single night like he did for the past 2 seasons. Jimmy Butler did that for him. And Butler is the guy that if Joel was having a bad night, you know that Jimmy Butler would come in and completely take over, and vice versa. We saw it in the Celtics game where Jimmy said to Joel, hey, I need you to get me through 3 quarters, and then I'll show up in the 4th because, he was washed from the game before when Joel didn't play. That's the chemistry that they had, and that's the player that Joel has needed throughout his whole entire career. Yeah. And the fact that the Sixers kept Ben Simmons, and I don't know if I would have changed it if we had to go back just because of the potential that Ben had, but you keep Ben Simmons and you keep Brett Brown. I mean, those 2 players, I think, consistently, or player and coach, ruin Sixers lives, ruin the Sixers fans' lives, because Jimmy was the key piece that they needed, and he's still good. You talk about being worried about giving James Harden a lot of money because of his age, and I know there was conversations about, well, if he gives Jimmy Butler the max towards the end of his contract, he's going to be washed up. We could have had 2 NBA championships by then. You give Tobias Harris a max. Tobias and Jimmy Butler, I mean, I really like Tobias, but how this team is constructed and the way Joel Embiid plays, it's Jimmy up here and Tobias down here, if I'm going to be honest, just because of the mentality that Jimmy has, the two-way player that Jimmy Butler is. And I have been a really big Jimmy Butler fan through my whole entire time watching the NBA, just because he's that guy. He's going to go in there, and if no matter what is going on, no matter if he's injured or banged up, you saw him in that elimination game. He played every single minute and he was banged up with an injury. That doesn't happen. And I think that's underrated. And just the talent that he has as a 2-way player, it's really overlooked. And I think one of the biggest mistakes the Sixers organization ever made was letting him walk. I really do. And I think that unless they can get a guy similar to him, or even Jimmy Butler back in some crazy alternate universe, that's going to be one that if Sixers don't win a championship in the next few years with Joel Embiid, that's going to be the conversation that's going to be had for decades.
Yeah, unfortunately, you're totally right about that. It definitely sucks, especially being literally against the Sixers and just seeing him being the exact guy that the Sixers really have been in search of. And the fact that he was literally on the roster is crazy. Jimmy Butler is sort of like a slap back at the analytical basketball in my mind, in terms of he's not a guy that shoots 3-pointers. He shot below 25% from 3 the last 3 seasons, but he just is able to turn it on, get to his spots, do whatever the team needs and pick his way to get there. And it's just kind of masterful the way he manipulates the defense, finds his pull up, finds his little 2-pointers, and he's just so effective in playing the game. And like you said, with the 2-way, being able to defend, I went down a little rabbit hole of his old Sixers time, just because I guess I like being miserable, but it's just so sad. When you think about him hitting the game winner and landing that little pose, the little ninja headband, him talking to Joel, yelling at him to shoot the 3, all these things that were so beneficial to this roster. And it's easy to look back now, given the career arc of Ben Simmons and everything that's happened with that. The decision ended up kind of basically being Ben or Jimmy, because that kind of was the spot at the time. And given the context at that point, it's understandable why the Sixers went with Ben Simmons, but looking back, it's clearly the wrong decision, and just so frustrating. I mean, that Kawhi shot, I also we're really ripping it out our hearts now with this, but if that bounces not in the way it did, once again, we're at a completely different spot, the Sixers. And I mean, obviously the Raptors went on to win, but it does really suck. And then to touch on the Al Horford, just he had to have been a double agent with the Sixers during the time he was here. I mean, this has been the only spot in his entire career where he hasn't been the effective player in doing it. And sure, a lot of it was usage because they just did not fit. The pieces were not together the right way, but it is incredible watching what he's doing with the Celtics and how flawlessly he fills that role. And just when we talk about a team that's just perfectly constructed, and him being such a key part of that is so frustrating. We'll dive back into the Sixers real quick in a second, but for the finals, what were your takeaways from game 1 with the Celtics and Warriors, and your overall thoughts on the series?
I think that the Warriors rested on their laurels a little bit after Steph Curry had that fantastic first quarter. And I just think this Celtics team, you talk about patience in the NBA, especially about, being Philly fans who have zero patience whatsoever. You talk about a team that had star potential with Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, and then Al Horford leaving and coming back. They have chemistry. They have what it takes. I think they're just better built, and defense wins championships. I love Steph Curry, and I think the Splash Brothers are absolutely phenomenal, and the Warriors have really good pieces as well. But the thing about the Celtics is their defense is so good too. You talk about Marcus Smart, who is in your face 24/7. They just have tough guys too. They have guys that are going to go out there and die for the ball. And that sounds stupid, and that sounds well, it's the NBA. Talent succeeds all, but sometimes it really doesn't. the Golden State Warriors aren't a super team. There's no really super team in the NBA right now. There's teams with really good stars. There's teams with co-stars. You talk about Jason Tatum. You talk about Jaylen Brown. Then you look at Steph Curry and Klay Thompson. They're together. You look at all these other teams in the league, Sixers, Joel Embiid and James Harden. And then you look at the Bucks, Giannis. You can talk about Chris Middleton as well. It's not necessarily every single player is a star, but it's putting these teams together and making them work and having that chemistry. And it's really exciting, as much as I hate to say this, growing up near the Philadelphia area, how Boston is rising to the occasion right now. I mean, they are just a completely compact team. And it hasn't been an easy road for them. In the beginning of the season, everybody looked down on them. And they've had a lot of injuries. You talk about Marcus Smart being questionable almost every single game. They're bagged up too. But the thing about them is they have it on both sides of the floor. They have the defense. They have the offense. I have this game going to 6. And originally I said the Warriors in 6 because I thought the offensive power would be too much for the Boston Celtics, and just how the Heat and Celtics series was so, Heat blew out the Celtics one day, the Celtics blew out the Heat the next day. I was like, there's no way they're going to have any game towards the Warriors. But watching game 1 and just seeing how well this Boston team is on both sides of the floor, I have to take Boston in 6 games. I really do. And that pains me to say it, but, the series is going to be fun to watch. It really is. I think it's going to be back and forth. It's going to be very close games, but you can't go up against a Boston team and solely rely on your offense. They said yesterday, I don't know if it was Stephen A. Smith, but one of them said that, good offense beats good defense. And I have to disagree. I think that the way the Celtics are able to turn their defense into offense, the way that Al Horford's able to clamp everybody up and then somehow hit 6 threes in the game 1, which has been the highest of his postseason career. I mean, it's just so exciting to watch. And it's finally, we're looking at the NBA right now. It's like, thank gosh, we're not just watching guys pull up from the half court line, as much as I love Steph Curry, but they're playing a complete game. And that's been really what I think has led to their success, especially through the postseason.
Yeah, it's been super impressive to watch. A very interesting clash of styles between these two teams. Very cool that both of them are pretty much completely homegrown outside of a couple like pieces, obviously the Horford return, stuff like that. But for the most part, like their key pieces have both all been like developed together, which I think is very cool. And looking at game 1, it was very impressive to me how the Warriors just kind of had control for most of that game, how they had their lead. They were doing that thing. They once had a 15-point lead, held pretty steadily by like 10. And then the fourth quarter hit. The Warriors leading by 12 points at that point. And then for the switch to just be flipped on in the Celtics, outscoring them 40-16 in the fourth quarter is absolutely absurd. And they just kind of hit a level that the Warriors couldn't keep with. And going into the series, I personally kind of also thought that the Warriors offense would be too much in the way they just like the way how many weapons they have, the way they move off ball. I thought the Celtics would struggle with that because they are obviously such a talented defense. But in my mind, I thought they were more of like a half court, like grinded out, not as great when you pick up the pace when you get them moving. But they adapted just fine. And I mean, they withstood the kind of the Curry mirage of shots right at the beginning, 21 points in the first quarter, and then just found a way to lock in. Like all the Celtics like role players are such stars in their roles. When we talk about guys like Grant Williams, Robert Williams, Derek White, who played fantastic last night, they just have guys that get it done. And when we talk about like the toughness, which you brought up there's an aspect of that I think is seen amongst all these postseason teams. When you look at the Heat, you look at the Celtics, even the Warriors have it. That's kind of like a recipe for postseason. And that's something that I think has been missing on the Sixers team for several years now. And I mean, obviously a guy like Joel Embiid's willing to leave his body on the floor way more often than I'm comfortable. But in terms of looking at like this entire roster, that feels like something that's very much missing to me. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think that's why you look at the Jimmy Butler letting him go and you kind of turn your head, because that's a guy that would have brought that every single night. That's a guy that would have put it all out there. Even if they were losing, you could never count the Sixers out because you have 2 guys on the court that are going to give it their all no matter what. I mean, Joel Embiid, that's the most frustrating thing I think about this postseason for me, is that Joel Embiid literally went out there, the orbital fracture, the broken thumb, torn ligament in his thumb, playing with one hand basically, playing with a mask where he can't see out of his peripherals, which I don't even really know how he did. And he still going out there. And listen, he wasn't the 30, 40-point Joel Embiid that we saw all season long. He just wasn't, because of the injuries and things like that. But he gave it everything he had every night. He was still scoring those 20 points. He was still working down low, trying to be the best defensively that he could. And then you look at James Harden, and this guy takes 2 shots. I was at that game, okay? And I think that was the most painful thing for me because there was loose balls that James Harden turned over, and he just stood there. Yeah. While Joel Embiid is diving on the floor for loose balls and probably can't even see if the guy's coming in and clashing next to him because of how his mask is. That's just unacceptable. And I think the same thing with Ben Simmons. Ben Simmons was the guy that wasn't willing to be aggressive and go to the basket because he was afraid of getting fouled and going to the free throw line. And that's something that you need in the postseason. I don't care if you're James Harden and you're a former MVP and you can sometimes go off and when you were with the Rockets could score 60 points a game. That's not the player you are anymore. And if you're not that, you need to make up for it in some way. I'm fine that he's not that great defensively. It is what it is at that point. The Sixers knew the player they got when they traded for him. But for him not to go after loose balls, for him to just stand there and not try the best he can do, that is something that cannot be overlooked. And if that happens again next season, the Sixers are in trouble because if I'm Joel Embiid, and I hate to say this because he's probably one of my favorite players to ever step on that court. And of course, you know, being from the Philadelphia area, the Sixers are the team that I root for. If I'm Joel Embiid, I'm saying, is this the team and organization I really want to be with right now? They are not helping me out. You know, the fact that Jimmy Butler said at the end of the game that he misses playing with Joel Embiid and that they love playing together literally just ripped my heart out all over again. And, you know, if you're Joel Embiid, you have to say to yourself, how much time do I really have? How much time do I have to keep dominating with my injury history? What can I do in my career? Because all this dude wants is an NBA championship. And the fact that he's the only one out there giving it his all when he's half a player, it's just completely mind-blowing to me. I mean, if you're James Harden, where is that drive to go on and win the hardware? Stop going out to strip clubs every night when you're in Miami or in Philadelphia. Like, this is your job. This is what you want to do. This is what you play for. Why are you going to go out there and not give it your all? And it just doesn't make sense to me. And listen, this is no disrespect to James Harden, but when you look at the Sixers team, Jimmy Butler's a guy that brought that toughness. And ever since he left, you haven't had that. And I don't know who they get in terms of that. Unless James Harden has a switch and turns it on and the Sixers are able to make a run next postseason and he's able to go out there and be the James Harden that people know he can be. Other than that, it's going to be really tough to try to find that player again.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I totally agree. I think this has to be kind of the lowest point Embiid feels about the franchise and his kind of outlook. But I still think there's a little bit of hope. In terms of like the toughness aspect, I do think that's able to be overcome with guys, the role players. Like when we talk, just kind of how we pointed out with the Celtics, guys like a Marcus Smart, who obviously is a terrific player in addition to this, but the way he's just able to assert himself, bring energy, that comes with the team. And it is a credit to Embiid how impactful he is on a mindset, but it's also just kind of an insult to the rest of the team. And in nights where he doesn't have it, which kind of it happens when like throughout the season and for the wear and tear that he has, nights where he just doesn't have his 100%, there has to be other guys that are able to step up and do that. So that's something that needs to be on the top of the checklist for this offseason, getting guys who are ready to compete every night, bring the energy, the Pat Beverleys, the guys that are just ready to get under your skin and chirp. But I don't know. There's a lot to work on this offseason. There's a lot still to play, but Kayla, it was awesome having you on tonight, chatting with you. Let everybody know where they can find you at.
You can find me on Twitter. I have to look it up real quick because I already forget my Twitter account. Kayla_Santiago 1. That's where I tweet all things Sixers. All things Philly sports was the first thing when I woke up this morning, seeing Joe Girardi getting fired and everything like that. So you know that I'll be commenting on all those Sixers things. And then you can follow me on Instagram at K_Santiago 1. And on TikTok, I talk nothing but Philly sports constantly going live, go live during finals games, make a lot of things about Joel Embiid, James Harden, all things NBA. And you can follow me there, Kayla Santiago 61. So those are all my social media platforms. And all I do is talk Philly sports. So if you're a Philly sports fan or a sports fan in general, we can definitely chat and it'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah, awesome, guys. Make sure to check her out. Check out all the content. A ton of awesome stuff. So thanks again for coming on, and we will talk with everybody next time.